In the depths of Kentucky's Appalachian Mountains in 1958, there lay a secret so dark it would remain buried for decades. Established in that isolated region since the 19th century, the Blackwood family engaged in a practice that challenged not just society's laws, but the very laws of nature. What follows is the disturbing account of generations of consanguineous unions, resulting in one of the most impactful stories of human genetics ever documented on American soil. Their home was a remote 40-acre property, surrounded by dense vegetation and protected by steep escarpments that made access nearly impossible for strangers. A self-sufficient system had been developed by the family, cultivating their own food and rarely venturing down to the neighboring city of Pine Creek, a community of only 800 inhabitants at the time. Now 89, Sarah Jenkins is one of the last living witnesses to these events and describes what many in the region suspected. They came to the city maybe twice a year to buy what they couldn't produce. Always the same man, Augustus Blackwood, with suspicious eyes and pale skin. He never brought the family. The official records of the Blackwood history begin with Jeremiah Blackwood, who arrived in that region in 1871, fleeing legal problems in Virginia. Documents from the time show he was accompanied only by his sister cousin, who would later become his wife. Together they established what would become a dynasty isolated by its own choice. At that time, marriage between cousins was not uncommon, especially in remote regions, explains Dr. Martin Calloway, a geneticist at Kentucky University who studied the Blackwood case. The problem arises when this pattern repeats for generations, exponentially increasing the risk of recessive genetic conditions manifesting. And that is exactly what happened to the Blackwoods. For almost 90 years, the family maintained a closed lineage, with weddings occurring exclusively among close relatives, brothers with sisters, parents with daughters, uncles with nieces. It was a web of relationships that created a progressively compromised genetic code. By 1958, when the story came to light, the family was in its fifth generation of consanguineous unions. The patriarch was Augustus Blackwood, great-grandson of Jeremiah, who controlled a property housing 27 people, all related in a complex and nearby way. The revelation of what was happening on the Blackwood property occurred when a severe storm hit the region in March 1958. A flood destroyed part of the isolated road leading to the property, forcing Augustus to seek medical help for family members injured during the storm. Pine Creek's only doctor at the time, Dr. William Carter, was called to accompany Augustus back. What he found there would forever change his perception of human capacity for isolation and the biological consequences of consanguineous unions. "I will never forget that day," Carter wrote in his diary, recovered only in 1982 after his death. "The main house was large but decaying. Other small buildings were scattered throughout the property. Augustus took me to a converted barn where I found a young man of about 25 years with a broken leg. But that is not what crushed me. It was his appearance, a significantly protruding, retreated jaw, clawed fingers, and evident cognitive difficulty. While treating the injury, Dr. Carter noticed sounds coming from the barns upstairs. Augustus tried to dissuade him from investigating, but the doctor insisted, claiming he needed to check for other injuries. What he found on the second floor was described by him as a vision that will haunt me until my last days. 5 individuals, aged by the doctor between 15 and 40 years, were confined in makeshift rooms. All had severe physical deformities, many unable to speak or understand, some with extremely limited mobility. Hygiene conditions were precarious, though there was evidence that someone was trying to keep them fed and minimally cared for. Check to see if you are already subscribed to this channel. The science behind these cases can reveal genetic secrets that impact the health of all mankind, including yours. Understanding how genetics shaped our evolution is essential. When confronted, Augustus Blackwood initially reacted with hostility, but upon realizing the severity of the situation, he eventually revealed a disturbing story that had developed for generations. According to him, the family believed it was purifying its blood through these unions, a distorted belief passed down as a family tradition. "My grandfather said that our blood was special, that it should not be mixed with that of strangers," Augustus would have explained to Dr. Carter. "When the first babies were born different, we believed it was just a temporary trial, that the next generations would be stronger." County records, though scarce, confirm part of this story. Between 1871 and 1958, only 7 birth certificates were officially registered for the Blackwood family, a number inconsistent with the known size of the family. Subsequent investigations revealed that many births occurred on the property without any official record, allowing the family to keep its most affected members completely out of public knowledge. It was these unregistered births that allowed the Blackwoods to maintain those with the most severe deformities hidden from society. These individuals never attended schools, never received proper medical attention, and in many cases, never left the limits of the property throughout their lives. The Blackwood case represents one of the most extreme examples of documented voluntary genetic isolation in modern America, explains Dr. Eleanor Whitney, an anthropologist who studied the case in the 1970s. What makes this case particularly unique is that, unlike other isolated communities that occasionally practiced consanguineous marriages by necessity or tradition, the Blackwoods did so systematically and intentionally for almost a century. After the initial discovery, Dr. Carter faced a significant ethical and legal dilemma. Kentucky laws at the time already prohibited marriages among close relatives, but intervention in isolated communities was complicated, especially considering that many of the adults on the Blackwood property had never been officially recorded as citizens. After 3 days of deliberation, Carter decided to report the case to the local authorities. Sheriff James Monroe, accompanied by 2 deputies, visited the property on April 2, 1958. The official report describes an extremely suspicious family with members who had clearly never interacted with strangers. "We found a worrying situation that requires immediate intervention," Monroe wrote. Individuals with obvious medical needs, inappropriate living conditions for those with disabilities, and clear signs of forced isolation of some family members. The authorities' intervention led to the removal of 8 individuals from the Blackwood property, all with significant physical deformities and varying degrees of cognitive impairment. They were initially taken to the Lexington Regional Hospital, where doctors assessed their conditions. Dr. Howard Phillips, a geneticist who examined members of the Blackwood family in 1958, documented a series of conditions now recognized as typical of highly endogamic populations: polydactyly, extra fingers, syndactyly, fusion of fingers, microcephaly, severe facial anomalies, and multiple cases of mental disability. "What we are seeing here," Phillips wrote in his medical report, "is the manifestation of rare recessive genes that, in populations with greater genetic diversity, would remain dormant. When close relatives have children, the likelihood that both carry the same harmful recessive gene increases dramatically, resulting in the conditions we observed." Equally disturbing aspects of life on the Blackwood property were revealed by the family's younger members. Martha, then 19 years old and one of the few who could communicate clearly, described how the most deformed members were kept separated from the others, living in structures adjacent to the main house. "Mom said it was to protect them," Martha explained to social workers. "She said the world out there would be cruel to them, but I think it was more to hide them. Some of them I only saw when I carried food." The authorities faced an unprecedented situation in dealing with the Blackwood family. Most adults removed from the property had no official documentation, no birth certificates, school records, or doctor's visits. Legally, they did not exist. The case generated a significant ethical debate. On one hand, the living conditions of those kept isolated were clearly inadequate. On the other, the family had developed its own care system, however rudimentary, and external intervention represented a traumatic rupture for individuals who had never known another reality. "The discovery of the Blackwoods exposed a flaw in our social system," says Dr. Richard Branson, a medical ethics expert who analyzed the case decades later. "As a society, we assume that certain practices are universally avoided. But this case has shown that in sufficient isolation, communities may develop radically different norms with devastating consequences." During the weeks that followed the initial intervention, the authorities mapped the complex family structure of the Blackwoods. Augustus, then 47, was simultaneously the cousin and half-brother of his wife, Eliza. Of the 9 children they had together, 3 had severe deformities and had been kept in the adapted barn. The investigation revealed that this practice of separation had begun 2 generations before, when the first obvious signs of genetic problems began to appear. Initially, these individuals were kept as part of the family, But as deformities became more pronounced in subsequent generations, the family adopted the practice of isolating them. Robert Blackwood, Augustus's cousin and one of the few family members who occasionally left the property to work seasonally on neighboring farms, provided a disturbing witness. "It started with my grandfather saying that the family's blood was special, that we should keep our lineage pure. When the babies began to be born different, he said it was a test of our faith, that eventually perfect children would be born. So we continued." This distorted belief had become a kind of family religion, with the patriarch of each generation reinforcing the need to maintain the purity of the lineage despite the growing evidence of the damage caused. District Prosecutor Richard Thornton initially considered presenting criminal accusations against the family's adults, but the situation had significant legal complexities. Many of the practices had begun in previous generations when laws were less clear, and there was no evidence of intentional cruelty, only of extreme ignorance and isolation. Media attention was another complicating factor. When the first reports began to circulate, journalists from all over the country converged on Pine Creek. The story of the Blackwoods, with its disturbing elements of isolation, consanguineous unions, and hidden family members, captured the imagination of the American audience. If you've heard about our history, stop a moment and think about the human suffering behind the sensational headlines. These are real people whose lives were shaped by terrible decisions they did not choose. Leave a comment with the phrase genetics to show that you understand the seriousness of this case. The Louisville Courier-Journal was the first to publish a detailed article on the case on April 15, 1958, under the title "Isolated Family Reveals Dark Genetic Secrets in the Kentucky Mountains." The article, although sensationalist in some respects, brought the first public analysis of the case's scientific implications. What we see in the Blackwood case is a dramatic demonstration of the dangers of repeated consanguineous unions, Dr. James Richardson, a geneticist at the University of Louisville, explained to the reporter. Each generation increases the concentration of shared genes and, consequently, the likelihood that harmful recessive conditions manifest. The article included photographs of the property, but not of family members, by court decision. Even so, the impact was immediate. Letters began to arrive at the newspaper, some expressing compassion, some horror, and some disturbingly showing a morbid fascination with the case. Mary Sullivan, a social worker designated to work with the family's younger members, documented the difficult transition they faced. They are simultaneously traumatized by the separation from their family and dazzled by a world they could barely conceive of. Elizabeth, 12, had never seen a television before and believed that people inside were real, just very small. The 8 individuals removed from the property were eventually divided between medical institutions and temporary adoptive homes. For those with more severe deformities and significant cognitive impairment, the future was uncertain at a time when care options for people with disabilities were limited. The Blackwood case caused significant changes in social assistance and surveillance policies in Kentucky's isolated communities. In the following weeks, the state's Social Services Department implemented a specific program to identify and monitor families living in extreme isolation in the mountainous regions. "We cannot allow another situation like the Blackwoods to develop without intervention," said Kentucky Governor A.B. Chandler at a press conference in May 1958. "We respect people's rights to live according to their traditions, but not when these practices result in clear damage to vulnerable individuals." The Blackwood property was partially expropriated by the state to cover the costs of care and assistance for family members now under government protection. Augustus and some adults from the family were allowed to remain on a reduced portion of the original land under the authorities' regular supervision. The fate of the individuals removed from the property varied considerably. The 4 with the most severe disabilities were sent to the Pine Meadows State Institute, an institution for people with intellectual and physical disabilities. Although well-meaning, the institution at the time offered mainly basic care with few opportunities for development or integration. "They went from one type of isolation to another," said Dr. Whitney in her study of the case. "The difference is that they now received proper medical care and decent living conditions, but they were still separated from mainstream society. For the younger ones and those with less severe disabilities, integration attempts were made. Martha and Elizabeth Blackwood, for example, were placed in a foster home in Lexington and eventually managed to attend a special school. Martha, who demonstrated remarkable intelligence despite limited education, eventually became an important voice in raising awareness about the dangers of consanguinity. In a rare interview granted in 1978 at the age of 39, Martha reflected on her experience. "I grew up believing that our way of life was normal, that the outside world was the one that was strange and dangerous. The transition was painful but necessary. Today I understand that what happened in our family was the result of ignorance and isolation, not evil." The scientific aspect of the Blackwood case became the object of study at universities across the country. In 1962, Dr. Phillips published a detailed article in the Journal of Medical Genetics analyzing the inheritance patterns and phenotypic manifestations observed in the family. The Blackwood case gives us an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of extreme endogamy on humans, Phillips wrote. The observed anomalies confirm theories about recessive gene expression in isolated populations and help us better understand genetic inheritance mechanisms. The article thoroughly documented the various conditions observed. In addition to those already mentioned, polydactyly and syndactyly, there were cases of cleft lip and palate, microcephaly, prognathism, a protruding maxillary, and a series of skeletal abnormalities. In some individuals, multiple conditions coexisted, creating complex clinical pictures. Blood analyses performed using the techniques available at the time confirmed the high degree of consanguinity, with serum protein patterns showing significantly larger homozygosity than the general population, a clear marker of endogamy. A particularly disturbing aspect of the case was the evidence that deformities had become progressively more severe over the generations. Recovered photographs from the property showing members of different generations revealed a clear pattern of worsening physical anomalies. "What we are watching," Dr. Calloway explained at a 1965 genetics symposium, "is the cumulative effect of inbreeding depression, the reduction of biological fitness due to increased homozygosity. Each generation of consanguineous marriages increased the likelihood that harmful alleles would manifest in homozygosis." The case also prompted significant ethical discussions in the medical community. While some researchers saw the Blackwoods primarily as an object of scientific study, others emphasized the human dimension of the tragedy and questioned whether intervention could have occurred earlier. "There were signs," Dr. Carter said in his statement. "People in the city suspected that something was wrong with that family for decades, but respected their isolation out of tradition. This raises questions about when respect for privacy should give way to concern for well-being." 6 to 7 years after the initial discovery, the legacy of the Blackwoods continues to reverberate in both science and society. The original property was completely abandoned in the 1970s after Augustus's death, and today is just a collection of vegetation-invaded ruins, a silent memorial to a human tragedy that developed far from the eyes of society. Martha Blackwood devoted much of her adult life to educating people about the dangers of consanguinity. Prior to her death in 2009, she helped establish a foundation that offers genetic counseling for isolated communities in the Appalachians, where genetic knowledge can still be limited. "What happened to my family was not just a personal tragedy," she wrote in her memoirs, published in 1990. "It was a collective failure of education, social assistance, and a system that allowed people to live so marginalized that they could develop such harmful practices without intervention." Advances in genetics in the following decades provided an even deeper understanding of what happened to the Blackwoods. DNA analyses performed in 1992 on some of the survivors confirmed what scientists of the time had only suspected. The family's coefficient of inbreeding was among the highest ever documented in human studies, surpassing that of European royalty. "What the Blackwood case has taught us," explains Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University, "is that genetic diversity is not just an abstract concept, but a fundamental biological need. When a population, even if it is only a family, becomes genetically isolated over generations, the consequences are inevitable and often devastating." The history of the Blackwoods also changed the way the social assistance system addresses isolated communities. The Kentucky program created in response to the case was later adapted by other states with remote rural populations, with an emphasis on offering services without unnecessary judgment or interference in traditional lifestyles. "The challenge," explains Robert Thompson, current director of Kentucky's Department of Social Services, is finding the balance between respecting a community's autonomy and ensuring that harmful practices do not occur in isolation. The Blackwood case taught us that compassionate intervention may be necessary even when not requested. The lessons of the Blackwood case echo beyond the Appalachians. Worldwide, researchers cite the case when studying other isolated populations, from closed religious communities to minority ethnic groups who, for cultural or geographical reasons, practice endogamic marriages. What makes the Blackwood case so valuable from the scientific point of view, explains Dr. Calloway, is that it shows not just the end result, but the gradual process by which genetic isolation led to the progressive manifestation of hereditary conditions over several generations. Today, the few direct descendants of the Blackwoods who know their family history usually prefer to remain anonymous, fearing the stigma associated with the case. Many have changed their surnames and integrated completely into mainstream society. One of these descendants, who requested anonymity, shared, "I grew up without this story. When I discovered it at 19, it was a shock. I immediately sought genetic counseling and found that, as my grandfather had married outside the family, my risk of carrying harmful genetic conditions is not significantly greater than that of the general population." The Blackwood case remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and ignorance about basic principles of genetics. It also highlights how distorted beliefs can be perpetuated in closed communities, leading to practices that, seen from the outside, seem clearly harmful, but from within can be perceived as traditions to be preserved. The story does not end with the Blackwoods, concludes Dr. Reynolds. Even today, in various parts of the world, there are communities where marriage between close relatives is common, either by cultural tradition, geographical isolation, or lack of knowledge about the associated risks. What we learned from the Blackwoods remains relevant and necessary. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying "I watched here" so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to leave your like and share this story with others you believe would be interested in these historical and scientific accounts that reveal little-known aspects of human genetics. And remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations into cases that science is still trying to fully understand.